language has been automated, and now instead of going and learning a difficult, arcane programming language that feels unnatural and takes quite a long time to give you the ability to express something useful with it, you can make an attempt in your mother tongue. But just because you can speak doesn't mean that what you're saying is wise, doesn't mean that what you're saying is useful. And all the increased chatter could turn into work slop, or it could turn into opportunity. That requires careful management as well.
Cassie Kozyrkov, welcome to Soul of the CIO, and welcome to Experience London. How's your day been so far?
It's been fantastic. Very happy to be here.
Excellent. We've come all the way to our sponsor of the Soul of the CIO, NextThink's DEX event, and you're a keynote speaker here. You just delivered an amazing session on basically, I suppose, like a very imaginative approach to AI in the workplace is how I describe it. And I wanted to pick up on one term you introduced to me during that presentation, right? Because I think we can all relate to it and it matters. And that term is work slop. We all heard of AI slop at this point, on the content level, but work slop. Define it for us,
It's
Cassie.
a great
Come on.
term, and I don't want to take credit for it. Harvard Business Review landed that one within the past week, and I'm applauding them. They have named the thing we've all been worried about.
They really have. No, is that HBR who
That's
named it?
HBR.
Well, they're getting quite quite slangy.
This is a piece of slang that I think deserves to stick around, and how I would define it on their behalf is when AI is used sloppily, carelessly, and finds itself entering work product because employees didn't take the time to be careful and thoughtful. It's a thoughtlessness it's thoughtlessness in work product. Thoughtlessness enabled by AI, because AI is the great thoughtlessness enabler. And that is why it's on us humans to re-inject that thoughtfulness back in. But when they don't, you can have things that look legitimate, things that look useful, things that are relatively hard to check or that maybe nobody knows to check, finding their way throughout the organization's work product, and later are just hard to root out, cost a lot of time, effort, hours, and create mistakes when we build on a shaky foundation. So that is a multifaceted take on work slop, which is essentially using AI badly in the workplace and everyone else suffering as a result.
I hadn't heard the phrase thoughtlessness enabler. Unpack that concept for us a little bit and why you think it's so important that we have it in view as we approach this new era.
In my keynote, I talked about multiple channels for AI. And when people could be talking about AI, they could be talking about the theory and research side of things. They could be talking about using data for automation. They could be talking about Gen AI, or they could be talking about agentic AI. The first of those channels, AI research, is very difficult to be thoughtless in. So we'll exclude that one channel. All three of the other channels have an element of thoughtlessness enablement. So let's start with the first one. When we use data for automation, that's like using examples to express our wishes instead of instructions. When we use instructions, we have to think about the instructions. We have to know the instructions. We have to express them carefully. When we use examples, we could say, hey, algorithm, look at that data set over there. You don't necessarily need to have seen it, and optimize that goal. Maybe you didn't even think very carefully about that goal, and use that to automate the process in the future. So how much thought are you forced to put in? You have to point to the data, you have to state the goal, or a goal, and off we go. Whereas if you were going to write the code or the instructions, right, you would have to think about each line. So you already have some thoughtlessness being enabled. Now, when we go to the generative AI channel, and we have automated language, right? We used all kinds of data of how humans communicate to automate language understanding. Now a person could ask for something, and they wouldn't need to be technical. They wouldn't need to have learned the hard way what happens if you don't specify all the requirements. They could put in very little context, and they could get something out on the other side, some work slop, that looks right at the surface, that's not fact-checked, that's not actually connected to what the business needs, not connected to what they need, and they could thoughtlessly put it in. And now agentic AI, oh, that is the wild card energy of all these things going very wrong very quickly, because that is taking generative AI and connecting it with tools. And now you can, without thinking very carefully, ask for something that doesn't just come back as text to you that you might yourself pick up and use somewhere poorly. Now, somewhere in your organization, something might be going wrong in a terrible loop, and you won't even know about it.
Can I tell you what I think is so interesting and insightful about your line of thought here is that everybody is preoccupied at the moment, like with the idea of redundancy, of AI making us all redundant. And what you're kind of saying is the biggest danger of AI is a kind of deleterious impact on quality and a capacity to prompt people to almost check out of whatever it is they're committed to, whatever their vocation is, whatever their work is. And
Asleep at the wheel, if you like.
and it becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, no? If you tell if there's a general sense of, oh, I'm going to be replaced by technology, that almost causes us to check out in a way on some level, right?
For the employee not empathizing fully with what leaders are looking at right now. And that is, leaders surely understand that this is going to change the world, that this technology is transformative, and those who embrace it and reach for more, as I said in my keynote, they are going to be defining the next era of business. And so it is so unambitious in that context to be looking at cost cutting when what you should be looking at is, how will my business participate in an incredibly different tomorrow? If you have the luxury of doing things more efficiently and at lower cost, reinvest everything into performing for tomorrow. And that includes keeping the people in your organization who are best connected to context, right? It is your people who know how your industry runs. It is your people who know how your business runs. And if you remove them, these AI tools are not going to serve you well. You will have what looks good at first, and then gently that train starts going off the rails and ends up stuck in the mud somewhere. You need the people who carry meaning. You need the people who carry context. Be ambitious. Be in abundance mode if you have that luxury, because you need to prepare yourself for tomorrow's world. So when you realize that smart leaders are thinking this way, then you realize that your position should be relatively safe if you're embracing tomorrow. One realizes that you don't want to drag your organization backwards, but the organization can't exist without humans. And it's not that difficult to embrace the idea that what's being automated is language. You as the human bring the context and the meaning, and should be fairly keen to use that language to push your organization forward. And in that case, you are its best champion.
While HBR have been coining work slop, MIT this week released a slightly more conventional study. You probably saw it, right? Brain scans of people who are using AI more than they should, or using it heavily, and they're showing kind of lower frequencies of imagination. I mean, I'm paraphrasing from something
Was
I saw on
that
social
this
media.
week, or I have a sense that study is a few months old, maybe.
You're no doubt right, but I saw it on social
Oh,
media
you
this
saw
week,
it
so
on
it
social.
becomes this week.
It
Okay,
has
I'm afraid it
arrived.
has to.
Yes.
But you know, it's not the first of its sort, right? Like, we do see a deleterious effect on creativity, sometimes displayed by excessive usage, right? And which is go on, comment upon that, because I know what you're talking about is, yes, there's a susceptibility to this perhaps with the technology if we're not on our guard, you know. So
Creativity is a funny one because creativity in the lab, as it's studied by psychologists, first it has to be operationalized. What is creativity? We won't all agree as to what that word means, so psychologists have to define it narrowly in a way that it can be studied. And one of the traditional measures has been how many unique ideas you could generate, how many unique uses you could come up with. So, for example, how many uses for a toothpick? And some people will say, well, you can use it to pick your teeth, and you can use it to stick an olive in a martini, and then we're done. And other people, like myself, will just keep going until you tell me to shut up. A sword for a mouse, right? Now, that operationalization of creativity, I don't personally, I don't feel that that is. That captures that much of what it means to be creative,
It's not
right?
qualitative.
Yes, the
Yeah,
fact
yeah,
that
yeah.
I can assign mice toothpick swords doesn't necessarily make me a creative person. But a tool like generative AI has even more unhingedness than I do. You can ask for 200 uses, you can ask for 2,000 uses, right? You can keep going and keep going and keep going. Is that creativity? I'm not so sure. The things that we might be less proficient at, often involving memory, often involving inhibition, machines can help us with. Right? So, a creative person plus a brainstorming powerhouse that will just keep coming up with swords not just for mice, but for butterflies and for all the rest of the animal kingdom. And that's just one category of the size of the animal kingdom. And then we can start coming up with all the things we could build, and then we could build them on the moon. You get my drift,
Yeah.
right? That plus a person with judgment who knows what's worth doing could be a very powerful combo. The idea of cognitive offloading and brains performing worse in some sense, again, according to some operationalization, which is its own new rat's nest, that I take big issue with, which is why you probably saw me rolling my eyes a little bit when you were bringing this up. Because my genuine belief here is that what we measure when we see any tool make us worse at something is either we are showing that we have a bad tool, because by definition, a good tool has to make us better, or what we're looking at is the propensity to be lazy. And not everybody is equal in that propensity. And again, our tools allow us to reach for more. And isn't it great that we're freed from the drudgery to go up a layer of abstraction and to use our abilities more fully? It's like saying, oh, how terrible for science that we have calculators. No, how great for science
Or
that we have
paintbrush
calculators.
rather than using your fingers on the cave,
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And actually, to your point of your paintbrush, I would always say, if you are willing to say that AI is creating art or being creative, you should also be willing to say that a paintbrush is creating art or being creative. It's just a tool for the creative process.
Given that kind of tendency, that potential tendency towards laziness, or the potential consequences of lazy usage of these tools, what do you see those potentially being on a macro scale, whether we're thinking about a corporation or the economy at large? This sloppiness, this work slop, this homogenization. What could the consequences be if we're not careful about the use and adoption of this technology?
I have an opinion, which no HBR studies or MIT studies back up. But my opinion is that these types of problems are relatively short-lived, and then the workforce adjusts and the economy adjusts. Again, we find ourselves reaching for more. We find ourselves holding people to higher standards. In the days before email, I would have ridden my horse to deliver you a letter, and then I get email. My boss isn't used to the existence of email, still expects me to ride my horse, and I think, why? I'll just bill 3 days for it, send the email. Right? You get the joke. But as the entire system adjusts, and as we understand what the technology is capable of, we start to say, well, you really spending 3 days sending that email? Let's hold you to a higher standard. Let's make you apply yourself a little bit more. And so everybody goes, onwards and upwards.
The market regulates itself qualitatively, you
I
might
would say,
say.
yes.
And so much of what you're saying seems to be like there's a contrast at the heart of our usage of technology, and particularly this technology, between the qualitative and the quantitative. Does that sound accurate? As like a alternative measures of value, and there's a potential tendency towards the quantitative, you know?
I think that humanity's taste for novelty can't be understated. Once we get used to some homogenized look and feel, the market will push for something that's different. And people are just naturally sources of difference, not just because of us being all biologically a bit different from one another, but us holding different context, different lived experiences, different taste. And that plus tools creates a lot of opportunity for very novel and beautiful things.
Soul of the CIO is sponsored by NextThink. Now, if you work in IT, you'll know too well how disruptions can derail productivity fast. NextThink's AI-powered platform for digital employee experience keeps you ahead. It uncovers issues others can't see and resolves them automatically with employee-centric AI and always-on automation. Employees stay productive, IT stays proactive and even preventative, and leadership sees results. NextThink, ahead of every IT disruption, behind every strategy. Learn more at nextthink.com. You were Google's, I think, might have it wrong, I haven't got it in front of me, first chief data scientist, was that your
Chief decision scientist.
chief decision scientist, I'm sorry. And how much of your view was impacted by that time at Google? What did you feel you learned? What were you working on with the workforce there, and what did you feel you learned from them that informed this perspective on this new technology?
When I joined Google, I joined as a researcher with 1 foot in research and 1 foot in data science, except at that time, we didn't have the data science job title. It was pre-data science. We then eventually made that ladder. But what you would think of a typical data science researcher hybrid working on was what I was doing. But I also noticed that in order for people who busied themselves in that intellectual way to be effective, you needed a lot of participation from everyone else in the organization. You needed leadership to think differently about how data is to be used to drive action. If it was for products, product managers, user experience designers, all kinds of not your typical data nerd participating. And how do we think about the larger structure, the larger process that allows data science and allows research to be effective in the first place? So to use an analogy, because that's very abstract, research and data science can feel a lot like being very excited to reinvent a wheel, to invent a wheel, reinvent a wheel, to make better and better wheels, and they're made of more and more interesting alloys. But at some point, what we need to actually be interested in is, where are we driving? And what does it look like when everybody's driving and traffic rules get quite complicated and we have to prevent crashes and we have to think about safety, so that all these wheels that we've made are generally making the world and the business better. So that's the decision angle. Start with what the actions are going to enable, bring together the interdisciplinary team, and then work together with data science in a process where you can actually near guarantee that effectiveness.
And here at London Experience, one of the key themes you hear everybody talking about today and no doubt tomorrow as well is digital adoption and AI adoption specifically. If you're thinking about smaller organizations, maybe more traditional organizations than Google, who are trying to adapt successfully to AI, what are some of the what is the guidance you would give to technology leaders and departments specifically in facilitating that process and helping their employees through that transition?
When we hear AI adoption, what a little baby robot that we adopt, very cute. Instead, to hear one of two things: either complexity adoption or language adoption. Complexity adoption is the one where you're using data to automate things. And the reason that you're doing that is that if you could just write the code, you would have just written the code. So there's something about the problem that stops you. And usually that's because the solution is too complex to fit in engineers' heads. It's ineffable. You just don't know what it is. You can't express it, so you can't write code. But if you have enough data, you might be able to extract those very complex patterns out of the data and then build software based on those patterns, right? And that's what you would think of as your traditional applied AI. Right? But that is the adoption of complexity. That means there will be edge cases you wouldn't have thought of. It means you won't know exactly how it works because it's too big for your head anyway. There are things that you won't see coming, so be very careful about safety nets. Be very careful not to get ahead of your skis. Be very careful about re-injecting that evaporated thoughtfulness about what the goal is and what the data set is, and is either one appropriate. Put as much thought into that as you would have put into the million lines of code that you have just had automatically made for you, right? So that's the one side, complexity adoption. And complexity adoption is one that digital experience leaders should be able to talk about and wrap their heads around better potentially than the rest of the organization. That there are opportunities to complexity and there are threats also, and there has to be a good case for going on an automation journey like that. The other side, the generative AI side, is let's forget AI. What we have is language. Language has been automated, and now instead of going and learning a difficult, arcane programming language that feels unnatural and takes quite a long time to give you the ability to express something useful with it, you can make an attempt in your mother tongue. Great, so now you have language. But just because you can speak doesn't mean that what you're saying is wise. Doesn't mean that what you're saying is useful. Doesn't mean that speaking is going to make your organization better. And all the increased chatter could turn into work slop, or it could turn into opportunity. That requires careful management as well.
And realistically, what does that careful management look like for IT teams presently, for CIOs presently? They're not used to these kinds of challenges.
An IT team understands what it means to put a bunch of undocumented code into production, right? Don't do it. Write more documentation, presumably, than actual lines of code. Otherwise, the technical debt that comes up is going to overwhelm you and make you at a minimum want to cry. So how do we think about encouraging teams not to balloon the technical debt? Right? There's intentional management. There's not a one size fits all set of tricks on that. We have an equivalent problem that comes up when you're able to speak all kinds of things into production without doing the homework to manage them, keep them safe, secure them, document them. Right? You're able to go very quickly and go very thoughtlessly, but just because you're able to do that doesn't mean that you should. Right? The smart ways to use the tools and the less smart ways. There are ways to select workers who have the judgment to approach it thoughtfully, and there are ways to fail to do that. What we'd like to see is the realization that it's not the technical nitty-gritty that matters here, that it is the judgment piece, and that will show up in all kinds of organizations in all kinds of ways.
A lot of CIOs and IT teams are used to thinking about the issue of shadow IT for the last decade and change, right? Now suddenly they have to think about the notion of shadow AI. How does that how is that distinct as a challenge to them, and how should they approach that as a management kind of conundrum?
I think one of the distinctions is that shadow AI use may be harder to detect, especially since it's a lot more flexible in the different ways that it could empower the employee or disempower the organization into which they're inserting their slop. So because you have such a flexible tool that's whose use is harder to detect, um, I suppose, yeah, there's all kinds of nightmare fuel as a result. What confidential information are workers putting into what kinds of tools? We don't even we're not even able to grasp the full scale of possibilities, right? When you think about the unsanctioned traditional tools, you could probably list them out. Maybe it would be a long document, but you'd be like, okay, here are all the things that my workers are going to do, and I can one by one start to secure against them. Here it's language. You can put anything in, you can get anything out. How are we going to make the checklist of what to secure? Now, of course, speaking of securing, right, the privacy and the security side, it's very, very difficult to create safe use. And as you constrain the employee more and more, the employee wants to go over to the unsecured tool and have at it. And we even see this with the tools with more lax guidelines. Let's say your Grok user versus your ChatGPT user. ChatGPT says, "Oh no, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that," and then we go over to the one that does. So you have this ease once your user gets familiar with how easy it is, and they will flow to the easiest possible spot. And and so the challenge then for IT is, how do you make that easiest possible spot actually exist within your organization?
Couple of notes I took during the keynote, Cassie, with regards to things we might not be thinking about in this context, which will quickly potentially could become quite outmoded because of these technological shifts around them. And I wonder if you could just comment on the notes for the pleasure of the audience. The death of a keyboard as one thing. You had a lovely description of how sort of torturously illogical the keyboard is as an invention and what its fate might be.
Yes, I can't wait. I can't wait. Well, I have a history. I have a history with this illogical device and clickety wrists as a result. But I think that we don't appreciate just how dehumanizing our technology is. We just take it for granted because we've grown up with it, and it's not wonderful or beautiful to have to think or produce at the pace that our fingers can navigate keys. That's not how we think. Surely something is getting lost as we devote cognitive effort and potentially pain to the keyboard. Whereas what feels more natural is voice. And as we move away from the unnatural stopgap measure that we've invented just because we couldn't interact with machines in the natural way, we'll find that we're able to be much more productive and potentially hurting ourselves a little less, our wrists, our necks, our backs. And we'll also see that then we have to start to redesign workplace experiences, because the workplace experience also expects something, expects that there's the keyboard, there it is on the desk in that particular spot, and that's why you're at that spot, right? There's a whole lot of whys that if we follow that chain of reasoning, it all ends up at technology that's not great, that's been distracting us from the most human parts of our work.
One thing that you mentioned, the death of and the theme of, that would have direct bearing, I think, for the audience is the death of a dashboard. You know, dashboard is a kind of peculiarly outmoded form of analysis, or of you described it as like a hearth people would
Yeah,
gather around.
exactly. The executives will find themselves gathering around what they've agreed as their source of discussion, when there are just so many different ways that you could slice and dice a complex data set, so many questions you could ask. And if you toss out all of data for a while, and all, all my lifelong career as a statistician, data scientist, data nerd, toss that out and just think about our senses take in all kinds of data from the environment. And we can see the same reality and ask very different questions about it and do so very quickly and notice different elements. So let's say you take an ink blot, right? Your Rorschach plot, and I'll show it to you and you say, you see a bat, and I'll say, but that's a pumpkin, and you'll say, no, but that's two piglets, and we could go on, seeing all kinds of different patterns in the same reality. And all those patterns are all there. And maybe if we go back to our discussion of the measure of creativity, how much do we push ourselves to see more and more and more angles of what these patterns, what these data might actually be? As we're more creative, we'll come up with 50 different things it could mean, 100 different things it could mean. And that's just your little ink blot. What about the reality around you? When you think about taking all that and boiling it all into one dashboard, what are the chances that that dashboard is the answer to the question that you should be asking in the moment? Fairly low. Fairly low. So it's more a motivational tool or a North Star if you pick a good dashboard. But as you get the ability to ask about reality, digital reality, data reality, on demand, just like you can look out the window on demand and notice whatever aspect you want to be noticing, will you state that there's only one way you're ever going to look out of a window and that's what we're going to gather around and that's how we're going to deal with information forever? Or will you realize that on demand, you could ask a question, I could ask a question, there could be different questions, we'll get very different sources of inspiration. And the nimbleness that we get out of that, the new way of working that we get from that nimbleness, could be very productive and very interesting.
Fascinating. Cassie Kozyrkov, absolute pleasure to have you on Solar for CIO. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.